Welcome to week 1 of our Samuel study series. If you haven't had a chance yet to watch the preview video for the Samuel series, pause this video and go back and watch it. In it, we introduce some important ideas and resources that will help us in our journey that we start today. If you haven't seen that video, then you're ready for this video. Go ahead and grab a notepad, a pen, and your Bible, and let's get started. Our series will be following the Sunday morning Old Testament readings from the liturgical calendar in year B. That places us first in Samuel chapter 3, which of course is an exciting passage for study, but it does require for us to do just a little bit of background work first on Samuel chapters 1 and 2 before we really dive into today's text. Now, the books of Samuel are of course known for the main three characters, Samuel, King Saul, and King David. However, in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2, we're introduced to a few characters that really don't take center stage for the rest of the book, but that are very important for us to understand how the story begins. We're really introduced to a family unit. There's a man named Elkanah. He's a presumably wealthy man, and he has two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Now, Peninnah's had many kids, which of course in the ancient world means that she is going to be someone who is considered blessed. Hannah, however, has no children. In the ancient world, a woman's identity was wrapped up with her ability to have children. So unfortunately, Hannah's inability to have children has left her broken. Now, she's the favorite wife, but Peninnah's the one that has had kids, and they have a rivalry. If you've read any of Genesis, you know how poorly things can go when someone has multiple spouses, and this story is just another example of that. I want to make it very clear, even though the Bible presents family units that have multiple spouses, that does not mean it ever presents that in a positive light. In fact, the Bible is very critical of the practice of polygamy. Having multiple spouses is never seen as good. It always leads to familial conflict, and here's just another example of that. So there's a rivalry between these two women, and Hannah weeps bitterly, and she prays. She makes a vow before the Lord. She petitions and says, God, if you will only give me a son, I will dedicate him to you all the days of his life. Hannah is saying, God, if you give me a child, I will make him a special person who is dedicated to you. Now, in chapter 1, we're told that this family would go up to the temple at Shiloh to worship every year. This is really strange because nowhere in the Bible are we told that a temple was built in Shiloh. But here in the book, we actually do have an early temple. Now, this is likely some sort of semi-permanent structure that the Israelites set up as they entered into the land. Since they weren't going to be wandering any further in the desert, they had made it to the land that God established them at. So it makes sense that there's a temple here, but it is kind of just a strange note. Now, it's at one of these times when Hannah goes to the temple and she's praying, and she's weeping, and she's moving her lips, but she's not actually saying anything. And so Eli, the high priest, accuses her of being a drunk. He says, get rid of your wine and stop being a drunk. And she says, no, I'm not a drunk. I'm petitioning to the Lord. I'm someone who's broken in spirit. And so Eli says, go in peace and may the Lord grant you your petition. From this point on, Hannah goes out and she is happy. She's joyful. She's no longer downcast. In fact, just a few verses later, we're told that Hannah does become pregnant. The Lord remembers her. Just like all of the other women so far in the story who have been barren or who have been in situations where there was relational conflict in a family unit that wasn't the way it was supposed to be, God remembers Hannah, and she bears a child. Now, this child is, of course, Samuel. Hannah takes a few years to take care and nurse her child until he's a little bit old enough for her to actually dedicate him to the temple service. And at that point, she does. So chapter 1 ends with Hannah bringing her son Samuel into the temple. She's going to dedicate him, and he will spend the rest of his life in service to the Lord. We begin chapter 2, and Hannah is now a changed person. In chapter 1, her petition to the Lord was one from a place of brokenness. She was weeping. But in chapter 2, she is a person who had been remembered by the Lord. The Lord had answered her prayer, had given her what she had been asking, and she is no longer a broken person. And she sings this song where she prays this prayer, and it's a beautiful poem in the beginning of chapter 2. Now, in chapter 1, we were introduced to two people who were serving at the temple. They were priests, and they were the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. We don't really get any other information about them until we get to chapter 2. After Hannah's prayer, we find out that these two sons, priests at the temple, did not know the Lord. Now, this is ironic. Who better should know the Lord than the priests? They're the ones who mediate the blessing of God to the people. In fact, they don't know Yahweh at all. They have complete disregard over the Levitical regulations that they were supposed to be following. They're preventing the people from being able to even worship the Lord the way that God had told them to. And beyond that, they're sleeping with the female Levites who are serving around the temple, presumably not their wives. All of this sounds a lot like pagan temple worship that the Canaanites were getting into. Now, these aren't Canaanite priests. These are sons of Eli. They are descendants of Aaron. They should have known better. They should have known Yahweh. But these two did not know the Lord. This, of course, is horrible, and it actually is similar to a situation that happened all the way back in Leviticus. In Leviticus, we have a story of the day that the tabernacle was set up. Two of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, get drunk. Now, as they're drunk, they enter into the temple and they present foreign fire before the Lord. This is very obscure, of course, but it seems that they're doing something with the menorah that they weren't supposed to be doing. And it also seems that they were doing something with incense that they weren't supposed to be doing. What we should take away is that these two sons of Aaron did not have any respect for Yahweh or the duties of being a priest, a representative of God. But this is one of the most serious jobs that somebody can have. And so the severity of their disrespect towards God is met with severe consequences. The fire of the Lord goes out and consumes them, and they die. Here in 1 Samuel, it's horrible what Hophni and Phinehas are doing, and it kind of begs the question, what's going to happen to them? Right after this story of the horrible things that are going on in the temple with Eli's sons, we actually transition to a pretty cute story. We have Samuel as a little boy. He is still serving in the temple as sort of the foster son of Eli at this point. But every year, Hannah comes back up with her family to worship at the temple in Shiloh, and she brings him a little ephod, a priestly garment. And so Samuel is wearing these. And this is actually the last time that Hannah is mentioned in the books of Samuel. This very, very important woman who was faithful in the midst of her horrible situation, who God blessed. And because of that blessing, we have everything else that happens in this series of narratives. But here is the last mention of her, and at this point she has been very fruitful. She has multiple kids, and her story, even though it's not perfect, does have a happy note here as we say goodbye to Hannah and we start to follow at this point Samuel. Alright, we've done all the background work we needed to. We can go ahead and begin now with 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. We're just going to go verse by verse and break down the things that are noteworthy, that might be difficult, and by the end we're going to anticipate some themes and ideas as we move forward through our series. Now the boy Samuel was attending to the service of the Lord before Eli, and word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. So here we have Samuel. Once again, he's a young child. He is being trained by Eli to be able to serve before the Lord as a priest. And as this is happening, we're given a note that word from the Lord and visions were infrequent in those days. This is a time when the relationship between Israel and God is at a dry place. Now, this may be a note about the moral integrity of Israel during this time. If you've read through the books of Joshua and Judges, you know that things go bad pretty quickly. So this could be a note explaining the moral state of Israel. It also might just be anticipating what's about to happen. Verse 2. But it happened at that time as Eli was lying down in his place. Now his eyesight had begun to be poor, and he could not see well. This is a strange offhand comment. This is the author's way of giving us prophetic insight into the character of Eli. There's really only a few places in the Old Testament where eyesight is used to describe someone, and every time it's significant in telling us about the righteousness or state of blessing of that person. This is all sort of a tragic irony, showing us the state and condition of the priesthood during this time. Even Eli, the high priest, has lost the blessing of God. Verse 3. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Now this also seems like a strange offhand comment, but if you watch the preview, you know that this lamp is actually really important. The menorah is actually really part of the symbolism and worship that the temple involved. And Samuel seems to have the important job of making sure that the fire, the lights, actually didn't go out throughout the night. Now the next few verses are going to start using repetition. Repetition in the Bible can be kind of tiring at times. Repetition was used for the sake of a time and place where you couldn't read what was being written. You had to hear it. And so repetition actually helps you remember the story. We're going to read verses 4 through 6 and just notice the repetition that's happening here. This is the biblical author's way of telling us something important is about to happen. You need to remember this. This is continuing the statement that began all the way in verse 2. But it happened at that time as Eli was lying down in his place that the Lord called to Samuel. And he said, "Here I am." Then he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. And the Lord called yet again, "Samuel." So Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down." Now, verse 7 is an important verse. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. This is almost an identical statement to the description of Hophni and Phinehas in chapter 2. They were priests who did not know the Lord. Here we have an anticipatory statement. Samuel is going to know the Lord. Verses 8 and 9. So the Lord called Samuel again for the third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down. And it shall be, if he calls you, that you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Once again, we should recognize the irony here. Eli is the high priest. He's able to recognize here that it's obviously Yahweh who's calling out to Samuel. But Eli isn't the one receiving the word of the Lord. Instead, it's this young person who can't even recognize Yahweh's own voice yet. He is the one who will be receiving this word, when the high priest is just in the other room. Picking back up in verse 10, "Then the Lord came and stood and called as at the other times." Before we even continue, we need to stop here. What does it mean that the Lord, Yahweh, came and stood? Well, I don't think that this is just an offhand comment telling us that there's a vision happening. I think when Yahweh comes and stands in a temple, that something important is about to happen. In fact, we can tell by textual clues that something important is about to happen. The only other time in the Old Testament when God, Yahweh that is described as standing is in Exodus chapter 34. Moses is now going back up the mountain in order to intercede on behalf of this people. And here we have God showing Moses his glory. God passes before Moses while Moses is hidden in the cleft of the rock. And God stands on the mountain. Now here we have a moment where God is about to reveal himself in a special and a unique way. If you want to understand what I'm saying, you should probably go read chapters 33 through 34. But what you should know is that here God is doing something unique. He is revealing himself in a special way. That's exactly what's happening also in 1 Samuel. Samuel hasn't encountered God yet. He doesn't know Yahweh. Now, I have no idea what it means that God stood, that he was standing. What I've found is that a lot of scholars kind of just say offhandedly, this is the beginning of a vision. But what does it mean that Yahweh is there? Well, we're in the temple. This is the place where God's presence dwells. I also hear in this notes tracing all the way back to Eden when God walked in the garden. Somehow God's presence here is manifested in a unique and a real way. So real that it can be described as if he was standing there. We continue. God called as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Now we also have another connection with Moses. In the incident of the burning bush, after Moses has fled from Egypt, he's in the wilderness. He encounters this bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. Yahweh calls from the bush and he says, "Moses, Moses." This repetition of the name twice is significant. This is a special call. And this is also something that Samuel shares with Moses. I think here we are building Samuel's resume. All of the ways that his calling is similar to moments that Moses has had is setting him up to be someone who's going to do important things for God. In this case, he's going to be the one who crowns the kings. Who better than someone like Moses, who's had similar encounters with Yahweh as the greatest prophet that Israel ever knew? What God tells Samuel next is actually really significant and very difficult. God is going to be upheaving the religious institution that was corrupt at that time in order to make a way for something new to take its place. And the ministry and the prophetic voice of Samuel begins. At the end of this chapter, we're told that God didn't let a word from Samuel's mouth fail. He was a true prophet, someone who at times had to deliver very difficult messages. It's not easy to be a prophet of God. The calling of Samuel sets the stage for the time of the prophets. Throughout the reign of the kings and 1st and 2nd Kings, the prophets are really active during that time. And the prophets were people called to go to really the kings to deliver messages of woe against Israel, but they were also very active in the courts of rulers. Imagine the difficulty that these prophets would have had in delivering those messages to the most powerful people on the planet. The significant role of being someone who mediates the word of God to the people is also equally intense of a position. Samuel isn't just a prophet, he is a priest. We are also told later on that he's a judge, so he is sort of a judicial leader, not a military leader like the judges of Judges. He's also the person who crowns the kings. This chapter gives us Samuel's credentials. It's his resume. We have this really impressive and cool calling story. And Samuel from here on out is not the same as he was before. He went from someone who did not know the Lord yet to now he knows the Lord. He is a prophet, a true prophet, and none of his words fail. Not only that, his story actually has important similarities with the life of Jesus. Hannah's song, her poem in chapter 2, highlights the main themes that also occur in Mary's song in Luke chapter 1. Now, both of these prayers or songs highlight the theme of power reversals, God remembering the lowly. Now, Samuel is also described as a young boy, as someone who grew in favor with God and with people. Jesus receives the same description himself. So the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and especially the character of Samuel, they're not just side stories. These are significant stories that pave the way for us to anticipate the royal leader, the faithful priest, the one who will come and be sent to destroy evil once and for all, to crush the snake. Samuel's not just a transition character, he is important. And now that he has stepped into his ministry of being a prophet, we are ready for what's going to come next in our following video.